Hello, Mike.
Good evening, Mohit. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again, my friend. So this is the 5th Thursday in a row, and it's is it the 5th one? I think so.
It seems to have been a long time, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our webinar here. And I can see that a lot of bird watchers are joining in today. Hello, Garan. Good evening. Tapashri, Bisham Dev, Mahesh, Sylvia, Salil, Prasad, Nishant. Nishant, fantastic, you're right here. And I will need a link of your blog a little later. I'm going to ask you to post it, so just keep that handy. Thank you very much for being here. Hello, Steve. How are you doing? Good. So Steve's favorite place is Assam, and he's been there a few times.
So we're going to hand over to Steve then to do this one.
Yes. And Brian and Richard, great to see you again. So good evening, friends. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Today, Mike is going to unfold his magic again with his knowledge of birds, especially of Assam. And that's one of his favorite places. He tells me he keeps going there again. Mike, you've been there many times already now, right?
Not so many, actually. And that's, of course, I should have been there for a really nice long trip last March and April. That was the first thing to be cancelled. And then, in fact, I don't know if there's anyone on this call who was planning to come with me because we had bookings for that trip. And then they all wanted to rebook for this March and April. Yeah. And of course, that's not happening either. So, no.
Well, we're still with the birds, so there's no problem, Yeah, great. So let me start now. It's 3 minutes over. And let me introduce Mike first, my friends. Let me tell you about Mike. So ever since his childhood in England, Mike has been fascinated with watching birds and recording and documenting bird sightings. Mike lived in Delhi in the year 2002. He was a very active member of Delhi Bird Club and a contributor to the Atlas of Birds of Delhi and Haryana. After he moved to Bangalore, he soon got interested in exploring sites that weren't visited so frequently. He worked for Bird Count India to help promote Indian birding and especially high-quality data recording. He's an avid e-bird reviewer for India. His interest in bird recording and migration led to a short-term assignment of running the BTO's Bird Track program. Each week, he would check the BBC weather pages to find out what the weather had been like in Britain, so he could write an article discussing recent bird occurrences. Also, Mike, before you begin your presentation, I want you to talk about Bubo, and it'll be interesting for people to know about Bubo as well. So, while I'm introducing you, I should introduce myself to those who don't know me yet. I am Mohit Aggarwal. I'm blessed with 4 children, a son and a daughter, 1 Labrador, and 1 escapee African grey. Professionally, I'm an experiential ecotourism specialist with deep love for nature. I help people travel to some wonderful places in Asia. I'm the founder of Asian Adventures, a 26-year-old travel company. It is the largest bird watching tour company in India. The company is on a large mission to help Asian elephants with their corridors, free the Himalayas of plastic waste, and help small wildlife NGOs and save the ancient Himalayan shrines. My interest is to promote ecotourism in the true sense and convert every tourist into an ecotourist. Now, today it was fantastic, Mike, because I got a letter of appreciation from an NGO that we've been working with that works in Kumaon Himalayas, and they sent me a letter of appreciation, so I'm really pleased. And we've been helping this NGO scale up their, social enterprise business, which they do for rural women folk. And they've been producing chutneys and jams and things like that. And then whatever money that they get, they empower these women. So I'm pleased with that. It was lovely. Okay, so Mike, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mohit. I better briefly mention Bubo then.
Bubo's right here. Back again.
Very, very quickly. Bubo started when I was, I met a few bird watchers at university. I was at university in Bristol in England. So we sort of formed Bristol University Birding Organisation, which was Bubo, partly because we'd just been on a trip to Belgium for a long weekend and seen an eagle owl, which is Bubo, as most of you will know. So Bubo has sort of stuck with me through Bubo listing that some of you might use to put your lists online. It started before the days of eBird and things like that for a bit of fun listing. And so Bubo stuck with Bubo birding as well. So I'm Bubo through and through. Anyway, enough of Bubo. We haven't got any Bubos in the presentation today, but to Assam. So the last few weeks we've been in West India, north and south, but to the western side. So today we'll head to the northeast, where we have many more birds in the northeast generally. So Sunil put lots of slides together and lots of good pictures that we were working through together, and there were far too many. So there's not quite as many as there were, but I still have to try and talk a bit less and show pictures more today, I think. But that's typical. That's the northeast for you. There's just so much bird diversity generally. So Assam is the gateway to the northeast. It's the sort of first state that most people visit on a trip to the northeast of India. And many of you will know it for tea, of course, and silk is the other main thing from there. So Assam is dominated by the Brahmaputra. We'll have a look at a map at the moment. And it's incredibly rich for biodiversity. It's full of rainforest, a lot of rivers, the tributaries of the Brahmaputra, lots of grasslands along the river, and a lot of fantastic protected areas. Everyone, I'm sure, will have heard of Kaziranga, which is one of the most famous reserves in India, and deserves to be as well. It's fantastic for animals and for birds. A few key species, the rhino, Indian rhino, we'll talk about more of that later. Pygmy hog, tigers are in northeast, although we'll hardly talk about them today. There's too much other stuff to talk about. And white-winged duck, we'll talk about a few good birds of Assam. So this is Assam. You can see just that's partly to show the Brahmaputra, which runs right through the state from west to east. And then Assam has a spur that goes down south, east of Meghalaya, and with Nagaland on the eastern border. And that's some of the hill ranges that must have some fascinating birds, but it tends to be quite overlooked. Not many people visit there. There's the sort of Karbi Anglong and Kachar hills that you may have heard of. Slightly off the beaten track, but we really should explore that area at some stage. And just to show on the routes that we're sort of taking today, we start at the Lokpriya Gopinath Bordalay Airport, is Guwahati, which is where you fly into. And Assam basically has two main roads that run south of the Brahmaputra and north of the Brahmaputra. So today we're jumping about a bit, but most of the main reserves are along the south of the Brahmaputra or the north of the Brahmaputra. So Manas in the west is as far as we go west, and then to Dihing Patkai in the far east of Assam. Here we have some tea. Assam tea is different to the rest of the tea in India because it's grown in the lowlands. Darjeeling and the Nilgiris, the other main tea growing areas, are of course highland tea areas. And Assam is one of the largest producers in the world of this region of Assam. But here's some of the fantastic rainforest. This is part of Dihing Patkai Wildlife Sanctuary, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But there's vast areas of this lowland rainforest in places, and fantastic birding and wildlife generally. Very cultural mix in Assam. Lots of different tribes, lots of ethnic groups who come from Tibet, from Myanmar, from other parts of Southeast Asia. And this is a dance from the Bihu festival. So there's 3 Bihu festivals in Assam, one of which has just happened. And one nice thing in India is that we have adopted, or people in Assam have adopted, some of these festivals to do a bird count. So the Bihu bird count just ran a couple of weeks ago. And there's several of these across India that have coincided with local festivals. And it's quite nice because there is a great cultural affinity for wildlife. So the Bihu bird count happened recently across Assam with the idea to try and visit several different districts and document all birds of Assam into eBird, and a report will come out on the commonest birds and some trends as well. But there's several areas of India that have a a bird count like this, involving hundreds of people out counting, all coinciding with some of the local festivals. And of course, Assamese food. The food is quite different to what you'd expect from your regular Indian food you're used to. There tends to be a lot there's a lot of veg, fish, and meat in the plains, and in the hills where it's more difficult to preserve food. They have a lot of fermented and dried food. A lot of fish. Rice is the main ingredient. Fish is very common, but lots of different meats as well. So pork is quite common. Duck is actually fairly common. You can see large flocks of domestic ducks as you travel around in Assam. Pigeon is eaten as well, actually. I've never actually had that there. And it's quite Southeast Asian, a lot of the food. It's not very spicy, but a very interesting mix. And partly because it's Southeast Asian, they do eat a few strange things like silkworm larvae and ant eggs and things, but I've never actually come across them. Next time. So the Brahmaputra, which we talked about, goes through Tibet, from the Himalayas, through Tibet, India, through Bangladesh, reaches opens into the Ganges and the Bay of Bengal and out through the Sundarbans. This is the 9th largest river in the world in terms of the sort of water flow through there. The Ganges is actually larger in terms of water flow, but not as long. But it dominates lives of the people in this area. The annual flooding brings very rich soils, a lot of agriculture from this. A lot of problems with the flooding, obviously, that you hear about quite regularly. But it really is the dominant feature of life in Assam. So here is part of the Brahmaputra. It's up to the valley itself is a sort of 80 kilometers, even 100 kilometers wide. I think the river reaches about 15 or 16 kilometers wide in the widest places some years. So some of the typical scenes in the Brahmaputra floodplains. And if you want a nice relaxing cruise, is a really nice way of traveling up the Brahmaputra by a comfortable cruise boat, where you can get off at various places. So the cruises get you off at KAZIRANGA, for example, and you can go and do some wildlife viewing in KAZIRANGA, and then you come back and spend the night on the boat. A really nice way of serenely seeing the Brahmaputra. And there's lots of birds as you go along. So Crested Pochards, much of this area. A few of the regular birds in parts of Assam. This is what was the Indian roller subspecies, but it's now been split. This is Indochinese roller, which is quite a lot darker than the regular Indian roller, darker blue, darker on the breast especially. But you find this in most of the northeast, where it replaces the regular Indian roller. Great Myna is another word throughout, often overlooked. It's also called white-vented myna, and you can see a tiny bit of the vent showing on this one. Good place to find great myna is actually looking at the backs of rhinos. So that's one thing when you're in. They work like being in Africa and watching oxpeckers. Ruddy Kingfisher is one of the more spectacular kingfishers. Actually a summer visitor here, so not too often seen. It's resident in parts of India, like the Sundarbans, for example, but not that easy to see here. Maybe if you come a little bit later in sort of March onwards, you can find them. And you get the Gangetic river dolphin, which unfortunately there are not nearly as many as there used to be. Used to be quite widespread. It's extinct from much of its range. I think there's probably just hundreds, less than 1,000 left, but mostly the parts of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. Some of you may have seen it at Chambal if you've done a trip down to that area. Which Chambal is a river that feeds into the Yamuna and then into the Ganges. And the Brahmaputra has an island in it, has several islands, but Majuli village, Majuli Island is in the Guinness Book of Records actually as the largest river island in the world. Although it might not be there anymore because apparently there's an island in Brazil that is actually larger, but it's in the middle of the river. So the Brahmaputra channels of it go either side of the island. It's quite an interesting place to stop at and see some of the villages and the tribes there. pottery, masks, and again, there's lots of different tribal dances from some of the tribes in here, and there's also good bird watching and majuli. But if you're not on that nice, comfortable boat I showed you at the start, this is how you cross the river. So again, if some of you have done, for example, going from Assam to the Mishmi Hills, where you need to cross the Brahmaputra, these are the sort of boats that cross, and you can see we'd drive our car on a precarious wooden planks under the wheels onto this, and the cars only just fit sideways across the boat, pile onto the boat, and then spend an hour or two sailing across the Brahmaputra. So this is a very typical way. They have now, if you are visiting Mishmi Hills from Assam, there is now a bridge. So you don't get this fun experience anymore. You get instead the longest bridge over water in India now, but much more boring compared to doing this trip. Guwahati is probably where you start most of your trips to this area. It's certainly where you fly into in western Assam, and you often fly out further east. There's a few sites in Guwahati itself. There's the planetarium. There's some nice gardens around here to have a look in for ruby-cheeked sunbirds and good birds like that. It also has the interesting, very near Guwahati is Swalkuchi, which is known as the Manchester of the East. I don't know if we've got anyone from Manchester now, or whether Manchester looks much more like this anymore, but it's a big handloom centre, as Manchester used to be, not so much these days. And also the annual boat race that happens in the village is here. Boat races on the Brahmaputra. And of course, food. This is a good street food snack. Jalmuri is made with puffed rice and then sort of tomatoes, onions, potato, peanuts. A little bit like bel puri, which some of you may have had in Mumbai and other places in the west. But if you're in Guwahati, one of the first places to start birding is often Deepor Beel. So Deepor Beel is right on the edge of Guwahati. Beel means lake in Assamese, and it's fantastic birding, very good for fulvous whistling duck, for example. But you see right on the edge of the city. That's the sort of landscape, and that's a flock of fulvous whistling ducks, which are usually outnumbered by lesser whistling ducks, but are in very large numbers there. It's quite a regular bird in East India, all the way to the south, actually, to sort of Chennai area, and but extremely rare in the west. Now, the duck's pintails are a very common wintering duck in most of India. Grey-headed lapwing is another bird that's very easterly, even though this also comes right down to the southern tip of India, wintering, but is very rare in the western half of the country. But you can get quite decent flocks in parts of the northeast. Striated Grassbird is a good bird to look for. This is slightly unusual because it's actually quite a prominent bird. It's quite large, it perches on top of bushes, it does a song flight, it's quite noisy. So it's actually reasonably easy to see in places like this, unlike other members of its family. So Indian grassbird, which used to be Rusty-rumped Grassbird, is now Indian and Chinese, is similar, but a lot smaller. It occurs in the same sort of area. Kaziranga is good for it, particularly. It's a lot smaller, and it skulks all the time, so it's an extremely difficult bird to see. But you can see and hear very often striated grassbirds in this area. And greater adjutant. So greater adjutant, which you can see at Deepor Beel, if you're lucky, is the extremely large stork, very endangered. It's the rarest stork in the world. If you're lucky, you see them at Deepor Beel. If you're not so lucky, you have to go to the best place there is to see them, which is the Guwahati garbage dump. They are a scavenger, and the easiest way of seeing them is to spend time in the rubbish dump here on the edge of Guwahati. So not the most pleasant place for birding, but this is we did a garbage dump, a carcass couple of weeks ago as well. So these places are good for birds generally. The greater adjutant breeds only in India and Cambodia. And there's only 1 or 2 regular sites in India, near Guwahati being the main one. It used to be very common across all of North India, certainly. They used to breed in Kolkata. They used to breed on the rooftops of buildings in Kolkata. It's probably going back 100 years or so. But now there's just a few hundred of them, and it really is extremely endangered. Partly through lack of nesting trees, mainly probably from pollution in wetlands and reclamation of wetlands. But if you do wander around the garbage dump, it's quite a sobering place, unfortunately. There's a lot of rag picking goes on, and plenty of children work on the garbage dump, sorting out rubbish to sell. So, an interesting place to go. But moving out of Guwahati, if you head east, one of the first reserves you get to, which is overlooked very often as people head to Kaziranga, but Pobitora Wildlife Sanctuary, I think, has the 2nd largest population of rhinos. And it's a very interesting place to visit, quite close to the city, really. This is the sort of flooded landscape you see in so many areas of the Brahmaputra floodplains. This is a view at Pobitora with some buffaloes in the background. These are wild water buffalo, or at least I'm assuming these are wild water buffalo. Unfortunately, there's a lot of interbreeding with domestic buffalo, so truly wild water buffalo are quite difficult to see. Kaziranga being one of the better places here. Kushitapu in Nepal also, but again, pretty endangered. 90% of the population lives in India. And I think it's probably all in Assam, nearly all in Assam anyway. And of course, the rhino. The Indian rhino is also known as the one-horned rhino. It is the largest of all the rhinos. And I'll talk about those a little bit more. Some of the birds in this sort of area, yellow bittern, there's a nice one. This is a female. Asian emerald dove, you can find in the sort of forests around here, usually flying through very fast and low. Lineated Barbet, you'll hear frequently in this sort of area. It's also in the western Himalayas, which is the western end of its range, and then it extends throughout Southeast Asia. Quite similar to the brown-headed barbet, a lot more white on the head and not so much of a patch around the eye. Lesser racket-tailed drongo, you also find this area, very similar range actually to lineated barbet. Just gets to the western Himalayas, but commoner here and then common throughout all of Southeast Asia as well. Greater racket-tailed drongo, which you'll see a bit more often, is also a similar range, but extends into central and southern India as well. White-rumped Munias, fairly common around here. So you can do a sort of jeep safari. This is Pobitora again, so this is some of the forest area surrounding the floodplains, where if you're lucky, come across some really interesting mammals, like the large Indian civet. And so then if you continue further along, which everyone, if you visit Assam, does, and you have to, you visit Kaziranga. So Kaziranga is very well known. It's in the floodplain of the Brahmaputra, and it was set up to protect the rhino. And it's now got the largest population of rhinos. And in fact, if you're visiting Kaziranga and you're driving along the road from Guwahati, you have to attempt to see a rhino from the car before you reach the reserve, which you can normally do. They're quite easy to see. But it's great for wildlife generally. So rhinos is fantastic for. Water buffaloes, which I mentioned, a large population of elephants. It also has a very high density of tigers. So you don't see them so often, but it's supposedly one of the highest densities there is. And for birds, it's fantastic. Flora can talk about some of the really interesting birds: Pallas's fish eagle, Slender-billed Vulture, blue-necked pitter, Oriental hobby. Some of these are very difficult to see elsewhere. Not very easy to see in Kaziranga, all of these, obviously, but some of them are. So Kaziranga itself, you can see, is all in the floodplain of the Brahmaputra, so it gets heavily flooded in the summer when it's closed for visitors. And you have various water bodies that are present year-round, various beetles, in fact. But it has three main ranges: Western Range, Central Range, and the Eastern Range. And if you're visiting, then it's almost a must. You have to do all three. Bird life and wildlife can be quite different. Experiences are quite different. So you can do jeep safaris through in each range. You can do elephant safaris in one or two of the ranges as well. On the eastern side, actually, I mentioned Sahola. You see there, Sahola Beale is the largest of the water bodies. There's fantastic numbers of ducks and other water birds. But of course, back to the number one, the rhinos, which you'll see around everywhere. So rhinos were very close to extinction through hunting. The recovery is very good. I think there's thought to be about 3,000 to 4,000 now in northeast India and in Nepal as well. Poaching is still quite a problem, and every year there's a few incidents of poaching in Kaziranga and around. But Kaziranga, Pobitora that we mentioned, and Orang, which we'll mention a little bit, are the three reserves that have rhinos regularly, and their populations have recovered quite well, so they've relocated some rhinos to Manas, for example. It's an impressive beast, as I said, the largest rhino. And in fact, there on top, of course, is a great miner. As I tell you, always where you find great miners, on top of rhinos. They're quite spectacular if you see them fighting at all. They do actually, I think quite often rhinos die from some of the fights that they have from their injuries from them. Elephants, large herds of elephants, you can see at Kaziranga. So if you're lucky, you can actually get a view. So some of the watchtowers, for example, that you can spend some time at. You'll very often be able to see elephants and rhinos in the same view, and so there's also the chance then that you can manage to see elephant, rhino, and tiger in the same view, which the last time I went to Kaziranga, we should have been able to do, because we were on a watchtower looking out at a large herd of elephants, a few rhinos, and a carcass which had some vultures going to it, which was apparently a tiger kill from the day before. And so we watched for a while, and then we decided to go for a walk. So we walked for a while, and then we came back an hour later, and in that time, the tiger had come through its carcass and then gone again. So we missed it. Water buffaloes are also pretty vicious creatures, so you have to be a little bit careful if you come close to them. And tiger, if you're lucky. So supposed to be, I think, about 100 or more tigers in Kaziranga, which is probably the largest density in anywhere in the world, larger than Central Indian parks or South Indian parks, which are probably still easier to see them in those, but they are seen quite often in Kaziranga. And some of the birds. So swamp francolin is quite a target bird here, very restricted range in the wet grasslands of northeast India and Nepal. Pallas's fish eagle is extremely good and reliable site for seeing Pallas's fish eagles at Kaziranga. Also, grey-headed fish eagle is here, and quite often a white-tailed eagle in the winter. Pallas's fish eagle is an extremely interesting migrant, and this was only discovered last year through some tagging studies, actually. But Pallas's fish eagle breeds here in Kaziranga, and so it breeds in the winter, and then it migrates north to Mongolia almost exclusively, where they spend the summer. So they're actually flying south to breed in this area of India, and then flying north for the summer. And that was all found out from a tagging study that was done with a few satellite tagged birds just from last year. So it would be interesting if they can expand that study and see what happens with Pallas's fish eagles in the western India, so the western Himalaya, for example, Corbett, where they breed as well. Where do they also head off to Mongolia for the summer? pied harrier is an incredibly spectacular bird, which Kaziranga is a good site for, and other places in the northeast. And vultures. So you'll come across vultures in a few places in Assam. So there's a young, I think, white-rumped vulture. As you'll know, these are critically endangered. Their population's extremely low. But you can see white-rumped here, and also Slender-billed Vulture, which is the rarest of the vultures. Be less than 1,000 birds probably now. And more restricted range. So Slender-billed is mostly in northeast India and through to sort of Cambodia areas. That's that area in Southeast Asia. Very, very like, looks very like Indian vulture, and they were considered the same species, long-billed vulture, until a few years ago. But interestingly, slender-billed vulture is a tree nester, whereas Indian vulture is a cliff nester. So Assam has a vulture breeding centre set up to help populations recover near Guwahati, and that has been pretty successful. So they've bred in captivity, I think it's 75 white-rumped vultures and 45 slender-billed vultures, and then we're hoping to release them regularly. But one of the issues we still have, unfortunately, and I think a few of you may have heard of this incident, but just a couple of weeks ago, there was a poisoning incident where several vultures were found dead in part of Assam, in eastern Assam. And I think it was 36 vultures, slender-billed, white-rumped, and the Himalayan, I think, which died from accidental poisoning. So it's poison put out for other reasons that cattle have fed on, and cattle died. And then, unfortunately, vultures feeding on the carcasses died. But there were 36 died. 8 were taken to a rehabilitation centre and actually successfully released just a few days ago. And what was very interesting, in fact, I should put the link in the chat later to look at it, is the villagers in the area actually held a wake for the vultures. So it's not these villagers who are poisoning them. They are very upset by the loss of the vultures in their area. And there's a nice little video on a Northeast India news website showing the release and some of the ceremonies they were holding for the sadly dead vultures. So a few other birds from Kaziranga, great hornbill, fairly common. You'll also have Oriental pied hornbill, quite commonly around Kaziranga. And one of the stars, if you could take some effort to see, but blue-naped pitta. Very difficult bird to see, but Kaziranga and areas around Kaziranga, even the tea gardens and places like that, are probably the best place in India, the most accessible place in India to see blue-naped pitta. Rusty-rumped Warbler, which is also known as Pallas's grasshopper warbler, is a tricky bird to see, one of the many skulkers in this area. And then from Kaziranga, most of you who've been to Kaziranga may well have also been to Nameri. So Nameri is on the north side of the Brahmaputra. Again, a fantastic reserve for birders. White-winged duck is probably the key bird to look for, but it actually is. It's a brilliant all-round place for birding. You're also able to walk in Nameri with an armed guard, because they do have plenty of elephants. But it's a spectacular experience to walk through the rainforest. And also, as well as walking, you can take a raft. So raft down the Jabareli River, another tributary of the Brahmaputra. And this is a typical scene of a lot of the rivers, rivers with mountains on the sides in Assam. So you can take a boat like this, rafting down the river, and looking out in particular for 2 really key birds. Ibisbill, of course, which winters here. I talked about that before on one of the other webinars, but really spectacular bird. And also scarce wader in this area is long-billed plover, which likes the same habitats, these sort of fairly fast-moving rivers with extensive shingle banks. Goosanders are fairly common on the rivers. Black stork, another bird, a wintering bird throughout a lot of India, quite reliable to see in this area. And one of the nice things about Nameri is there's a lovely place to stay. So this is Nameri Eco Camp, and you can see the grounds of this are lovely. It's actually walking distance from the river and then across the river into the main sanctuary. And the birding in the camp is fantastic as well. So the last time I was there, we were having breakfast. I think we'd been for a short walk to the river and birded around the habitat there. We came back for breakfast, and we sat down for breakfast when a shout came out of pied falconet. And of course, we all leapt up out of breakfast and ran outside to the lawn here, where there was a pied falconet perched in one of the trees surrounding it. So one of the best, more reliable places to see pied falconet, and also Oriental hobby, another extremely difficult bird to see in spots, but both of them, if you're lucky, you can see from the lawn of the Nameri Eco Camp. So if you do walk down or take a short drive down to the river, you pass through some nice habitat with some great birds like Siberian ruby throats and things. And then you can walk along the edge of the river where you've got thick forest on the side. Osprey is quite an expected species along the river here. But one of the birds you're really looking out for in this area are these wreathed hornbills. And in particular in the evenings, if you're somewhere with the river valley, you look across the forest, you can get quite large flocks of these flying over to roost. Very often, in fact, if you're in the trees a little bit rather than by the river, you'll hear the whir of their wings as they go over before you see them. And if you're lucky enough to see one close and perched, they're a very impressive bird. Himalayan buzzards come down this low in the winter. A bird you can find in some of the floodplains quite regularly around here, also in Guwahati Depot Beale, but also actually parts of North India is Bengal bushlark. And some of the really nice birds of the forest, broadbills, silver-breasted broadbill, which in India is restricted to the northeast, and then it goes throughout Southeast Asia. So a lot of the birds you get in this part of India are of Southeast Asian origin. So you'll find them through Thailand, Malaysia, and to Indonesia and places like that. Whereas in North India, the biggest proportion of the birds are of Palearctic, so Europe and Western Asia origin. But the thing I think that with the Eastern Himalayas and Northeast India generally, you've got a mix. So that explains a lot of the large diversity of birds here. Pygmy Flycatcher, or Pygmy blue Flycatcher. It's quite a fairly common bird in the forests around here. Not so common at all, black-breasted thrush. Occurs dotted throughout this area, but not easy to see. But there's certainly been quite a few sightings, again, from the Nameri Eco Camp itself. Some of the other wildlife, there's a lot of big wildlife in this part of the world. Gaur, or the largest bovine, the largest cow in the world. And some of the primates you can find, capped langur, which is found here and into Bhutan and parts of western Myanmar. Fairly accurately named as this black cap. If you're really lucky, and this person particularly was, to get one in such bright light in the daytime, but leopard cat occurs in this area. But a lot of these small mammals are quite tricky to see they're tricky to see everywhere, but northeast India. There has been and still is quite a lot of hunting of small animals. So even for squirrels and things like that, you find parts of the northeast India in Assam, Arunachal, Nagaland and places. A lot of animals and some birds can be pretty tough to see because they have been hunted quite heavily. And if you do a walk around in the night time, potentially even again around this camp, slow loris, you may be lucky enough to find. So this is around this sort of area. Again, some of the other tribes, the missing tribe or Miri tribe, are present in this area north of the Brahmaputra. And then on to Orang. So Orang National Park is not so often visited, but does deserve to be for animals and birds. It's on the north side of the Brahmaputra, same side as Nameri, and it's the only place on the north side which has good numbers of rhinos, but also excellent for many birds. This is part of Orang, a mix of grassland and more open forest in this area. Hog deer, which you can see here. You can also see this at Kaziranga. It's a small deer, and I think it's named after a hog because it's supposed to be a bit pig-like in behavior, so it doesn't leap over obstacles like many deers would, but it would crouch down and go underneath. Speaking of hogs, the pygmy hog. Now, pygmy hog is a very small pig. It was thought to be extinct in the world, and it was rediscovered in the early 70s. And there was a captive breeding program set up for these I think in Guwahati and other areas. And it's been fairly successful. So quite a lot of captive bred animals have now been released into Orang in particular, which is, I think, probably got the largest population of them now, maybe a couple of hundred, something like that. But also some of the other sanctuaries in this area have had pygmy hogs released. And of course, we have some more rhinos. And those are probably, again, great miners. Could be jungle miners, but they're probably great miners again. Elephants and orang too. Black-necked stork again is an endangered stork. You see in North India some of the large wetlands, so you'll see them in the west around Bharatpur and places like that as well. Kaziranga, Orang, places also good for them. And a few other slightly more regular birds, plaintive cuckoo, which is fairly common here, but again, it doesn't really go further west in India. It's a very much easterly bird. Large-tailed nightjars is the commonest nightjar you'll find in these areas. Oriental Scops Owl, one of the common owls, common nocturnal owls you'll find in this area. And on to Manas. So Manas, we've actually headed back west now. Manas is north of the Brahmaputra again. It borders Bhutan, and most people who go there end up coming back saying, this is the most beautiful park I've ever visited. This landscape is spectacular. Wildlife is great. Used to be very difficult to visit a few years ago. It had large poaching problems as well, but now has become much easier to access. Definitely worth a visit. It does have Bengal florican, as does Kaziranga, probably a bit easier to see in Manas, but not easy anywhere. Clouded leopard occurs here and is certainly much, much more difficult to see. Rhinos, they've had rhinos translocated here, water buffaloes, but a lot of birds. So a lot of the florican, some of the laughing thrushes, quite a lot of grassland birds. We'll talk about a little bit further as well. But here is a similar view again with the rivers, the shingle-sided rivers and mountains in the back. There is one of the clouded leopards. So that would be a highlight of any trip to the northeast. But you can see that for large mammals, Assam is a brilliant place. You may not get to see them all, but there's a lot of variety of some of the spectacular mammals. Not quite so spectacular, but it does have a macaque for Assam. The Assamese Macaque. It's actually not restricted to Assam at all. It goes through Southeast Asia for a few countries there. But this is the regular macaque you'll find in this area. And there's a Bengal florican. So like the lesser florican, which we talked about last week. It has a spectacular display if you're lucky enough to be there in sort of monsoon times, which is difficult to visit, but they do a similar jumping display to a lesser florican, although lesser floricans go up and down fairly vertically. So Bengal floricans do a sort of curve and then land a few meters away. But you can, unlike lesser florican, which migrates throughout the peninsula of India and sort of disappears into India, it's very, very rarely seen in the winter. Bengal floricans are known not really to go very far at all, so they still winter in the same area. So places like Kaziranga and Manas, you have a chance of seeing a florican if you visit in January, February time. Whereas if you want to see a lesser florican, it's they're somewhere in India, but we can't really tell you where they are. So you have to go for those in the monsoon. Rufous-necked hornbill, one of the other spectacular hornbills you can find. Black-crested bulbul, one of the commoner forest birds in Assam and other areas around here. And long-tailed broadbill. Broadbill's a fantastic family. So long-tailed broadbill is reasonably common here and also occurs in west of India, northwest. Street spider hunter is a common bird in these hills and also further north in Arunachal. It's one of the commonest birds you can come across. Little Pyemy Flycatcher is a little gem. Scarlet bat flowerpecker in several places in some of the gardens. You'll find this really nice looking flowerpecker. And rufous-necked laughing thrush, which is actually fairly widespread through the northeast, but never an easy one to find. So this is quite a target bird as well. Okay, and then if you head back over the river again, this is now heading further east, so probably about 5 hours or so from Kaziranga, heading east. The Hoolock Gibbon Sanctuary is a very interesting little sanctuary. It's a small area of forest, but it's completely surrounded by tea gardens. But it has some animals that you really don't see very easily anywhere else. This is a sort of habitat you can see. There's the sanctuary on the left and the tea gardens on the right. But what you do have here is the Hoolock Gibbon. So this is India's only true ape, although actually it's now been split. So this is the western Hoolock Gibbon. The eastern Hoolock Gibbon also just occurs in India. It goes further east. It occurs in eastern Assam, so you have both of them in Assam. A little bit of Arunachal, but that's it. But these are fantastic if you can see them. These swinging through the trees, and their calls are spooky as they ring through from miles away. So it's well worth if you do visit Kaziranga to do an excursion out to spend a day in Hoolock. Because it's not just the ape, but it also has a couple of primates of interest. This is stump-tailed macaque. And these are Southeast Asian mammals that just reach sort of western limit of their range in India. Stump-tailed macaque and pig-tailed macaque, both of which you can see in the Gibbon Sanctuary here. So a few good birds. Amur falcons. You can have very large numbers of amur falcons. When we come to this part of eastern Assam, we're not very far from Nagaland, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the main migration staging site for amur falcons. Black-naped oriole, and if you're really lucky, a very similar slender-billed oriole can occur in this area. Mountain tailor bird, which is quite an interesting bird. It's not really that closely related to the other tailor birds. It's a very long bill that it has. It's more of closer to some of the other warblers than tailor birds. And white-bellied Erpornis, again, a fairly unusual bird. It used to be known as white-bellied yahina. Yahinas are a small group in the Babbler family, but white-bellied Lepornis is not actually that closely related to the babblers. It's more closely related to vireos. So it's it's a genus that doesn't have any other species in. The white-bellied is the only Lepornis. And Pygmy Cupwing, which used to be known as Pygmy Red Babbler. Amazing little birds here with such rounded wings and almost no tail whatsoever. Pygmy is the most regularly encountered of them. And then to Dibusaikua. So continuing further east, we're sort of in eastern Assam now, on the southern side of the Brahmaputra still. Dibusaikua is a fantastic grassland site. It's not so easy to visit. A lot of it's flooded, and it's not so easy to access many of the bits of the reserve. But it's particularly good for a lot of the difficult grassland birds. And if you're a serious birder, you've got to come to this sort of area, Dibusaikua, and nearby Nameri Beal, which is a wetland very close to it, because the grasslands here support a lot of very good birds. So black-breasted parrotbill is one of them, but lots of the skulking babblers, so Marsh Babbler, Chestnut-capped Babbler, Jones Babbler, Slender-billed Babbler, and some wintering warblers, spotted and white bush warblers. So it's a place for trying to weed out some skulkers in the reeds and the typha beds here. This is part of the habitat of good for wetland birds as well. So Dibusaikua itself you can access by a boat and then walking in parts, and then look for some of these ones. So Chestnut-capped Babbler is also found in the western parts of India, northern parts of India, and is a really smart one of the babblers. So this is a reasonably common but not very easy to see. And then you have some of the real specialities here, which are not so common and not so easy to see. This is Marsh Babbler and Jordan's Babbler. This is the eastern population. So there's a population of Jordan's Babbler only discovered in very recent years in Harike in Punjab, and right on the western side of India. Different subspecies and potential split in the future. And speaking of birds that have been split and also occur in western India in Punjab and Harike, swamp grass babbler, some of you may know as Rufous-vented Prinia. So Rufous-vented Prinia was split, unsurprisingly really, because the two don't seem very similar, into, and they're not Prinia either, so the name has now been changed to realize it's a type of babbler. So this is swamp grass babbler, which occurs in this sort of area around Dibusaikua, Margari, and some other parts of the grasslands here. And then in the very west at Harike, you have Rufous-vented Prinia in areas around there, which is now also Rufous-vented grass babbler. But this one is a difficult one to see. There's various places from Guwahati eastwards, so you can see it, but never easy. One of the spectacular birds here, black-breasted parrotbill. This is a great one. Look at the size of the bill on that. These are a grassland parrotbill, unlike several of the others, which are more bamboo specialists in the forests and the hills higher up. Chinese ruby throat is another skulking bird from here. This one's not skulking because this was actually taken in the summer. There's another split that used to be white-tailed ruby throat, split into Himalayan ruby throat in the west and Chinese ruby throat in the east. Although, interestingly enough, Chinese ruby throats do get to parts of Ladakh as well, so you get both ruby throats in that area. And Jordan's bushchat, now extremely rare in India. Dibusaikua are probably the best place to see it. Chestnut Munia is slightly easier, much like the tricolored Munia we have in other parts of India, which again used to be considered one species and now split. So this is the area around Margari Beal, where you can stay and do boat trip out onto the Beal. So the Beal, again, Beal means lake, but it opens out onto the river. So it's mostly a still water lake, but then opens out onto the main river, the Dibru River, as it is here. So looking for things is a cotton pygmy geese right there. But one of the things you're particularly looking for in this area are ducks, like falcated duck, spectacular male falcated duck, and Bear's Pochard, which is extremely rare, thankfully recovering population, mostly in China. But if you want one place you can get to see it occasionally in India, is Nameri Eel. And then on to Dihing Patkai. So Dihing Patkai Wildlife Sanctuary is a fantastic area that doesn't get visited enough. People might visit briefly on their way to the Mishmi Hills, for example, in this part of Assam, which is the entry point to Mishmi Hills in Arunachal. But Dihing Patkai is worth a few days' stay of its own. It's a very large area of lowland tropical rainforest, and there really isn't much of that sort of habitat around anywhere in the country now. So excellent diversity of birds, a few good specialities. This is a sort of landscape, dense forest, lots of rivers. It's quite humid, and you'll find a lot of swampy pools inside parts of the forest here. A few of the dry areas you can walk through, but these swampy pools in particular are the place to look for white-winged duck. Some of you may have been on Vivek Menon's talk last week about white-winged duck, but it's extremely scarce duck on these pools. In Assam, here, Dihing Patkai and Nameri are the two places that get regular sightings, but not very easy to see at all. And there's very few sightings now outside of these two places. So that's hence Vivek was talking about the project the Wildlife Trust of India have to explore parts of Arunachal Pradesh to try and find more white-winged ducks. But a few other birds here. There's lots of woodpeckers, actually. There's one bay woodpecker, which is a particularly smart one with a really pale bill. White-brown piculet, like tiny birds that are related to woodpeckers. Tailed flycatcher is a difficult bird to find much of the northeast, Dihing Patkai being one of the better places for it. And as you can see, it's not very easy to see that it has white in the tail, but it does. White-crowned forktail is the rarest of the Indian forktails. Dihing Patkai is a reasonable place to see it. Black-backed forktail is around here, so you have to be a little bit careful with your IDs. And streaked wren babbler, another of these birds. We've actually had several that we've been talking about here, which taxonomically aren't really understood very well. So streaked wren babbler, which here is definitely the best place to see it in India, and then occurs elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but it's not really so closely related to the other wren babblers we get in India. It's more closely related to something like Abbott's babbler, which you can find in Kaziranga and lots of places in the northeast. So there's plenty of birds that are not very well understood. Plenty of a few splits will come out in the next few years, I think, as people study some of these birds. Brown hornbill could be one of them. So this is brown hornbill that we get in Dihing Patkai. This is Austin's brown hornbill. Also occurs into Thailand a bit, where they also have Tickle's brown hornbill, two subspecies currently. But a scarce and endangered bird, difficult to see anywhere in India. Dihing Patkai and Namdapha probably are the two places to see this bird. And no better way to finish than hornbills over the forest in the evening. The wreathed hornbills again flying over. So that brings us to a cliched end with our sunset again. But it's a quick race through Assam. So some familiar sites, some sites that really should get a lot more birding. And it's well worth a trip to Assam only and not to pass through to go to Arunachal or other places. Brilliant place for birding. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. That was absolutely brilliant. Another brilliant.
There's a lot to cover. There's a lot to cover there, isn't there?
Lot to cover, and you've just shown only a glimpse of what we have there. So it was good. I just want to tell people that don't go away. I have lots to give you, share with you, and it just doesn't end at that. Another 5 or 7 minutes, and then we'll let you go. So here is one poll that I am going to publish right now for you to answer. And then once you've done that, I'm going to have another poll. In the meantime, I'm also going to share some files with you, which you can take home with you. And those are earlier trip reports of Mike, of Rajasthan, of Chambal, people who missed that. They can download that, and then also all that Mike has shared. I've shared some of the text with you, which you can, go through, store it in your system, and do, mull it over as you go along. So let me just sharing this. Okay. The third thing that I want to talk about, Mike, here is the project that WTI is spearheading to find white-winged duck in those places where it hasn't been reported before. So this is a nine-month project. And what Vivek is looking for are people, photographers who are going on their own, and if they report white-winged duck, they'll be suitably awarded. And the second thing is that if there are very serious, capable bird watchers who have 15 days at hand, they can go and join one of their, hunting, scouting parties, and they'll be able to host them while they're there. Two of my lads are joining them soon, Mahesh and Deepak, in the next couple of weeks. So they'll be with them. So lucky them, And then, so the third challenge which they are facing right now is, the paucity of funds. They have some money, so they've started the project, but they're still looking for. I think they managed to get some money, but they're still about $8,000 or $7,000, pounds short. So that's about 6 to 7 lakhs short. So I'm going to post a link here. Just share it with your friends who might want to give 30, 40, 50,000 rupees as a contribution to the project, and that'd be lovely. So here Farina has posted some links here in the chat, and the last one, it says no, she's written it wrong. It's not white-bellied duck, it's white-winged duck. Well, even if you give it to white-belly, they'll still go to white-winged, so don't worry about that. And then there are some other links that you can join a community. The second thing is that, Mike, you are going to be traveling very soon to some of the places in South India or North India, or any of these places. So friends, if any of you want to travel within the next couple of months and join Mike for his birding trips, Mike, I'm going to post your email ID here and let people get in touch with you directly for any of those tours that they might want to take up with you.
Certainly, because we had, unfortunately, because of no foreign visitors for us at the moment, we had a couple of trips that we would have done that we're not doing anymore. But that means we're flexible for times and places, dates and places. So if anyone has anything they want to do over the next couple of months or so, maybe visiting Gujarat and Rajasthan that we did last time, fantastic at the moment. I see it was Sumit, I think, asked about the best time to visit Assam, and it depends a little bit where in Assam, because I think from November on to sort of April time is all good time to visit. So we often visit so these sort of eastern parts of Assam, the Himalayan and places in the March-April time sometimes, but now is also fantastic. And Dibrugarh and Dihingpaka, you mentioned as places to stay. So Margari Beal, who we talked about, has a couple of nice camps to stay. There's also a site I didn't mention at all here, but Digboy I could have talked about. So Digboy is the oil fields, lots of lovely lowland forest quite close to Dihingpaka, that with permission you're allowed to go in and do some birding, and there's some places to stay there, and that has a couple of birds that you don't really find anywhere else as well. So collard tree pie, chestnut-backed laughing thrush I could have talked about, but yeah, so there are a few good places around close to Dihingpaka and Dibu, and coming now would be good. Yep. In fact, if you're interested, I'm free next week. Let's go.
Absolutely. And join Mike, just write to him, and even if you've got Mike, even if you get 4 or 5 people to accompany you, just do the trip, just go have fun, Well, we're far more safe than the other people are across the world from Corona. And, I think it's the Indian spices that save you from all of that. So,
keep you dosed up with some good spices, and that's what keep things off.
Yeah,
But it's listen, quite a lot of people in India now are traveling. It's a shame the foreigners can't visit us. I know a lot of people who are really keen and have been talking about trips for next year now. But a lot of people now are traveling in India, and I think especially when you get to some of these remoter areas, it is perfectly safe, and it's good to travel and give a bit of business to some of the people who've not had any for more than a year now, or a year.
Yep, absolutely. And I've also, Nishant has posted his link here for his blog. After he's just done this blog on white-winged duck, and it'll be worth your while to go through it. Nishant is a fantastic blogger. He's one of the top 100 bloggers, wildlife bloggers of India. So just go through his piece, and then you'd be able to know more about it. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for your appreciation. And Mike, you might have met Steve at the bird fair sometime.
I think it would be a very long time ago. I haven't been to the bird fair for many years. But yeah. And actually, I've just added a link in the chat as well for an article about the vulture poisoning recently, because there's a fantastic video you can watch about the villagers and the release that was done there. So that's really interesting to look at.
Wow, we've given so many things to people. They just go on clicking. Just keep opening the windows in your computer, and then later you can go through it when you finish. We're almost done. Usually we don't go. We're 7 minutes past our finish time, and we've got 2 polls. We've shared our files. We've talked about our tours. We've talked about conservation. White-winged duck. If you can find some money coming into that, I'll just put this link again here, and I'd really be grateful if you can contribute, or if you can find people who can contribute, $8,000 to $10,000, pounds, whatever it takes, or 30, 40, 50,000 rupees each. Even if largely what we're looking at is about 20 people coming together and giving 500 each. As simple as that. So it does the job for the 9-month survey. And if you manage to find those ducks in different habitats other than where they are currently, it'll be one huge step towards conservation. And this is what we're doing. This is what we're living for. Business is one of the conduits to do it. It's one of the pipelines. So while that's there, this is something that we owe to this planet. So I think that's what. Mike, over to you if you want to say something else.
I think I've said enough.
Okay, friends.
Actually, one thing that might be quite interesting as well is we'll be back to talk about something else, maybe some other area of India. So, but if there's anything anyone would like to know about, again, drop us an email. Maybe we haven't said what we're talking about next week, have we? So maybe we could talk about. We could continue in the northeast. We could go up to Arunachal, or we could do. We haven't really covered main areas of North India that we do quite a lot, like the Uttarakhand areas, Ladakh or the Andamans, going a little bit further afield. We could do one of those, or Amur falcons. I've mentioned Amur falcons every trip, but we haven't really talked about them. So maybe people want to know more. So if there's anything you want to know about, drop it in the chat or drop us an email, and we'll sort something out for one of the next webinars.
Fantastic. So the poll says North India for the next one. I put a poll, so that's it, North India. But anyway, so we will still wait to hear from people for the next couple of days before we take a decision. Fantastic, Mike. Thank you for being here, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We hope to see you again soon. Do keep that link in your files or wherever, and you'd be able to see me more often. If you get bored, let me know. See you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
See you guys.